Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Balance with Britt podcast. I am so happy that you're here. This week's episode is going to be one that you are happy you tuned in for because I am chatting with Bonnie from Shift Nutrition and Wellness. Now, Bonnie is a nutritionist and well-known digestive health expert. She has helped hundreds of people all over the world get to the bottom of their chronic digestive issues so they can live their lives without the discomfort, embarrassment, and inconvenience of persistent symptoms like chronic constipation, gas, bloating, and heartburn. Bonnie is the creator of the Shift Your Gut Therapy Method, a professionally designed comprehensive group program that is reflective of nearly a decade of clinical experience. The Shift Your Gut Therapy Method is a 12-week process that combines a personalized approach to understanding a patient's gut health with a group support and education component as well. In her clinical practice, she helps clients with chronic digestive issues like IBS and those with blood sugar imbalances, pre-diabetes, type 2 diabetes, by providing customized nutrition and lifestyle support to help them transform their health one meal at a time. So in our conversation today, Bonnie and I are chatting about a super important topic. We are talking everything but the food, key strategies for healing your gut while still enjoying some of your favorite foods. And we are going to touch on some really important points today. And Bonnie, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Britt. It's so good to be here. I'm looking forward to this chat.
Thank you. Me too. Bonnie and I have been chit-chatting for a long time. I'm talking her ear off here before we start recording. And I said to her, I'm like, this is something I'm so bad for. I need to start recording this conversation because I love these digestive health chats in particular, because as we know, we're both very passionate about this field. And these conversations are ones that I just enjoy so much. Because we can just totally nerd out, record it, people can listen to it.
That's it. Completely nerd out. I'm in for it. I'm in for it.
Now, Bonnie, I would love to chat first and allow listeners to get to know you a little bit. And, what brought you to helping your clients the way you do with digestive issues? Do you have a story involving digestive issues? And, what did that look like?
That's such a good question. I absolutely do. I think so many of us who practice in this space or in the health-related space do come to it with our own experience. And in my case, I actually have a history of inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease, which is autoimmune in nature. And fortunately for me, in terms of my personal history, it did involve some excellent medical care, conventional medical care. But it didn't involve any advice whatsoever with respect to diet or lifestyle. I'm going back 30 years now, but still to this day, I mean, I know, in my own case, and also hearing from people who are sort of, struggling through that process of new diagnosis, or even having been, in acute flare every few months or whatever, that unfortunately that is mostly still the case in traditional GI environments. So that was a major frustration. And frankly, that is one of the major reasons why I decided to study nutrition to begin with. But then, as you know, being a CSNN grad yourself, it's an excellent education. But when it comes to sort of very specific areas, it really requires us to go down several rabbit holes on our own and get additional further education. In my case, what I came to learn was that I learned about gut health as a default, sort of trying to figure out the whole Crohn's autoimmune piece, because gut health, or really healthy gut microbiome, a healthy and intact intestinal tract, is actually essential and the key to whether or not somebody will express an autoimmune condition, right? Whether you'll actually become symptomatic. So anyway, without going too far down that rabbit hole, absolutely, that brought me to, develop a bit of an expertise in this area because of the type of information I was looking for myself.
It's I think one of the most powerful pieces of our work with clients is that, we've been there. And I went down a similar rabbit hole with digestion and gut health for me in the context of mental health.
Uh,
And because we know how important the gut is for so many things.
yeah,
And yeah, I think it makes us more empathetic and able to help people who have been or are currently going through something that we have been through,
yeah,
and help to, eliminate some of the confusion and overwhelm. So, and especially when it comes to digestive health, because there is a lot of information out there, a lot of conflicting information. And I think the thing that you and I both know is that the reason there's so much conflicting information is that there's no real, direct path or black and white path. Everyone is so different
yeah,
that there's no such thing as like, do this and this will work. It's like everyone is different, rooted in different things, and you need to appreciate that we're all a little bit different, and there's some
yeah,
things that can, help many of us on our journey. But yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And that I'll add to that by saying that is one layer of it. And the other layer is that it is so multifaceted. There's so many
Mm-mm.
things, as we just even between the two of us demonstrated, that there's so many different reasons, right? Or
Mhm.
original causes or roots, let's say. And the remedies are multifaceted. Like you said, there isn't really like a one answer, like a silver bullet. And
Mhm.
so I think from a lot of the discussions you've had on your podcast, you really demonstrate sort of the multi layers of health, right?
Mhm.
So that's where gut health, I think that's also why discussions around gut health, people looking for that one answer, and why it becomes so frustrating for people who are symptomatic or at the beginning stages of where we were before we even figured it out for ourselves, is
Mhm.
that you know, you try something, as we said in our preliminary discussion before we came on air, you kind of try something for, a little while. You feel that it's not working because it doesn't usually take just a couple of weeks for something to necessarily, you know, cause transformation or help with transformation. And so you abandon that one thing, right? And then you move
Mhm.
on to something else. So there's different ways of approaching this. And I mean, I think that's what we're going to talk about
Mhm.
today, right? Which I hope people will find really helpful.
Mhm. Yeah, this is what I said. I have a bad habit of doing this before we even start recording. We're talking about this perfect hurricane of digestive issues and how so many people now are experiencing such digestive discomfort. I think in the context of like what I work with, stress and anxiety and the stressful world we live in is a really common root for many people, but there's tons of other common roots as well, right? For different people. And I think the world we live in now is so conducive to digestive disturbance.
Yeah,
And we were saying how sometimes it's just this perfect storm that creates a digestive issue. And when we are working to, find some relief from it, we try one thing, maybe it doesn't work. We try something else, doesn't really work. And we also need a bit of that perfect storm and the right duration of time and consistency. And yeah, we're gonna definitely dig into all of those factors. But know that if you're listening and you're like, what are they gonna say that's not different than anything I've heard before? Sometimes it is that perfect hurricane of things, right?
yeah,
And one thing I see all the time in my own practice is people, cutting out more and more food, but still feeling like garbage. And this is what we were talking about today is like, everything but the food. At what point do we stop blaming the food? And, why do you think it is that, you know, when we continue to cut and cut and cut and still we're feeling terrible and having to just cut more foods?
yeah. Okay, thank you for asking that. Too bad we're not on camera because people would see how I'm just like chomping at the
I'm
bit to
ready to
answer this
go.
question. This is a really important part of the conversation, and I'm so excited to talk about this. So, if I had people listening if I wanted one thing, people listening to hear clearly, it's that our the paradigm under which we sort of talk about food when it comes to digestive ailments and disturbances is wrong, in my opinion. We talk about food as the culprit, as you said, right? And that's so common. And it's understandable because I know I relate to that, and you do too, right? Because we were trying to figure out, what is it that I'm eating that's causing me to have this flare up in the middle of Crohn's or whatever. And the bottom line is that the way, and I also, like in my practice as well, one of the things that I focus on is I do think of food as medicine. I do not look at food as a culprit. Yes, we can have a separate conversation, and it's a valid one to your point about all the things going on in our North American lifestyle, particularly these days. Our food is definitely affected. We'll put that into quotation marks. So we do definitely consume a lot more toxic matter, and we definitely aren't necessarily leaning into the most quality whole food type of diet that we imagine ourselves in a health kind of paradigm to be talking about. But remember, one of the first things we learned at school, homeostasis. Our body is phenomenal at achieving balance, right? So it's not as if you can eat a bag of barbecue chips and it shouldn't put you into a terrible space. That's a fact. That's how our body is designed, right? There's just so many factors that load and stress and lack of movement and environmental exposures. Things. There's so many things that affect it. But food on its own, we need to shift the paradigm a little bit to start looking at it as a remedy. So in other words, by doing that, when we sort of have conversations with our clients about the foods that we want them to start eating, right? That all of a sudden makes less room for the foods that might be problematic or the foods that they're cutting out. Now, we probably should honor the people listening who are feeling that everything they eat at this stage is making them feel unwell. So I do understand why people avoid certain foods. But it's important to also know that by avoiding a lot of foods, for example, high FODMAP foods would fall into that category. The problem is that there's a lot of healthy foods in that category, in the fermentable categories. And so the longer you eliminate them, right, the more problematic it becomes because your gut bacteria actually is nourished by a lot of those foods. We need the types of dietary fiber, for example, that is aggravating to a lot of people who are symptomatic. So it's really tricky. And this is where I think that guidance by a professional is important because, you sort of get pushed into like, how much is too much? Like maybe if I go slowly, like nobody really understands how to find the balance of introducing the foods that, you might find problematic for right now, but eventually you will be able to consume without issue. And again, Britt, that sort of comes into the idea of all the other factors, all the other layers of things that we need to introduce in order to make our system tolerate the food, right? And to actually receive it, break it down properly, like all of those steps in the digestive cascade need to be working in tandem to help that happen. So I feel my heart goes out to people, and I'm sure you receive people like this all the time. Clients who come to you, they've tried everything, they're eating 5 foods now or whatever the case may be, and it's a bit heart-wrenching, but it's understandable when someone's in that space to know that help is around the corner. Like a little bit of guidance goes a long way in those situations. So I don't know if I answered that question adequately, but the bottom line is that I understand why people do eliminate foods, and I have absolutely implemented some elimination in the beginning of stages of work with people in order to allow their system to have a bit of a break, in order to allow their system to kind of become more resilient before, sort of going full force with foods that we know are beneficial to them.
Yeah, you illustrated it in a great way. And one kind of example I use often, both with clients and on the podcast, if you're listening, you're like, I know where she's going with this, is this like digestive bonfire analogy. And you're like, the more wet logs we throw on that fire, whether it's from, stress, inflammatory foods that we're intolerant to, low fiber, microbiome imbalances, whatever it is, all these wet logs are really snuffing out that flame. And we should be able to have some barbecue chips and not feel totally terrible. But if we have such a sputtering weak flame, all it takes is a couple of barbecue chips to really make you not feel great. So
I love that analogy. And actually, I'm sure you've talked about it before, I've heard it, but just to be repetitive about it, it isn't that the food is the problem. It's that digestive capacity is impaired, right? So a food intolerance, it can be quite discouraging for people to think that, oh my gosh, I'll never be able to eat whatever XYZ favorite food is again. And it's not likely to be the case, right? Both of us worked with people who over time do expand their diet to, even where it originally was. But the bonfire analogy is a good one. You can't possibly expect a fire to flourish if not all of the right elements are in place to create that fire, right? If you keep throwing water at it.
And even like you said, sometimes, in the beginning of a journey with clients, we need to do a little bit more restriction than ideal because we need to pull some of those wet logs off so that we can build that foundation. So, let's chat a little bit about what might be behind some of these food issues and these food intolerances. We've already chatted about a couple of them, being, stress is a really big factor that influences digestion. And this is something that I talk about over and over and over again. So I sound like a broken record, but aside from, that stress factor that we've already touched on, what are some other factors that might be playing a role in someone's reduced digestive capacity, resulting in some of these issues digesting food?
I think the components range from everything to the type of diet you actually are consuming, right? So for example, something simple like not having enough dietary protein. I mean, the byproducts of protein, amino acids, are essential for our body to produce stomach acid, for example. So it can be connected to food for sure in that regard. But also there's so many components that people don't consider. Like, for example, I'm not going to say specifically people who have had a history of eating disorders, but disordered eating. For example, you rush through your day, you get to the office just in time to hit your first meeting, you haven't had a bite to eat, you don't eat, anything until sort of you're grabbing something as you go make your coffee in the lunchroom type of story. You grab a little bit of something, but you're not having a full meal until dinner. Well, I mean, our body timing gets completely out of whack. And then it's really almost unfair to expect our system to, because you're still hungry, you're going to consume almost as many, if not more, calories, let's say, later in that person's day, right? And forget the calories, but just the quantity of food that has to be processed in a fairly short time could cause a problem. And if you do that, enough months and years in a row, eventually that can be a cause of the dysfunction. So that's something fairly simple and straightforward, right? It's not really a body problem or incapacity, but it can become one, in my opinion. So remedying that involves, adopting very different and effortful for some people new habits around planning meal timing, for example.
Meal timing is so important. I think this is one of those things that you said. I can't remember if this is before recording or when we were recording, but so many of us are looking for that magic silver bullet of like, this is what we need to do so that I can eat my favorite foods again. But we commonly, and I see this a lot with clients too, overlook some of those habits like meal spacing. And like you can only digest what your stomach is physically capable of digesting in one sitting. So if you're eating more than your digestive capacity and eating only one large meal per day, we're not getting as much out of that meal because we just can't digest it all. So meal spacing and having, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, not relying on coffee all day long until you get to dinner. All of those things are not only, stressing your body out, impacting your blood sugar balance, but also physically your body is just unable to break down those foods because you're just getting so much at once.
Yeah.
That is something
think of it as an assembly line. The guy who's fourth in the assembly line is suddenly having to do the lion's share of that project's work, right? And if the guy wasn't able to do, he might have been struggling to do his own piece. So the reason I put it like that is I'll use that analogy very often too, because people who end up with digestive dysfunction or issues like constant bloating, constipation is a very, very, very prominent one in that sort of scenario we just described. If you're already vulnerable and you're causing too much pressure on the fourth guy in the assembly line, let's say, right? It becomes, so later in the day, for example, digestion, it becomes almost impossible to climb out of the hole, if you will. So implementing, like you said, meal spacing changes the stress piece. When people think of stress in terms of the connection to digestion, I mean, we know that we're talking about, and I know you've talked about this a lot, but we do know we're talking about, which part of our nervous system is engaged through digestion and which part needs to be. So we know that we need to be in parasympathetic state in order to digest optimally. But more than that, again, it's not just mental stress, right? Foods we eat, the fact that we're not feeding our body until very late in the day and consuming all this energy during the day, like it's often underestimated, those factors.
I try and make that clarification often because we think like, okay, I'm stressed, but I'm never not going to be stressed. My job is stressful. My home environment might be stressful. And you're just like, Brittany, you're preaching to the choir. Like, I know I'm stressed, but I can't do anything about it. But you can. And I've had this conversation with friends and family. There are certain stressors that, yes, we don't have as much control over, but we can have control over our ability to deal with those stressors by focusing on, how we're nourishing. Are we sleeping well? Those physical stressors on the body. I refer to stress as like, I feel like I always come back to the stress piece, but I think it's so important just because of the world we live in. And if we have a bucket and, we're filling our stress bucket with different things, we have control over the nutrient density of our foods and the types of nutrients we're getting in. Sleep. Are we just relying on coffee all day long and not eating anything? That's stressful on the body. Are we moving our body? Are we over exercising? All of these things can be adding or removing from our stress bucket and allowing us to deal with like the stressful work environment a little bit better, or, the stressful conversation that we need to have with a family member or a coworker. So absolutely. I think it's really important to reiterate that the goal is not like eliminating stress, but improving our capacity to deal with it.
Yeah, definitely. And stress. Sleep, you mentioned, is also such a significant factor. And again, people who are trying to figure out, why am I bloated every day? They're not necessarily looking at their sleep patterns, right? And your body needs to be in a well-rested state to function optimally, never mind all of the things that happen when you are in sleep mode, right? The hormonal factors involved that affect digestion and everything else. So it's sleep we touched on, it's meal timing. It could be for some people the type of movement that they engage in during the day or none, right? Like here we are sitting, and I know you'll relate, like I sit like this too in front of my screen, post-pandemic sort of clinic, running my practice in front of the screen, sitting with my organs all stacked one on top of each other. So like getting up and stretching even in between whatever daily meetings one person has, or activity, that kind of thing. We're not talking about like necessarily exertive exercise when it comes to digestive improvements. We're talking about just making sure your body's moving. Right. So that sort of factors in as well, which I think, again, these things, fortunately, all of us are now spending time talking about it. Those of us that actually are in practice helping people solve this problem or these problems. But when someone enters into this space, I don't think this isn't actually the type of thing they're being told by their doctor. At the very most, someone with IBS will go through hopefully the gamut of tests that should be gone through and required, and then come back to their family doctor's office and be handed like a crumpled piece of paper about the low FODMAP diet, because it's really the only nutrition resource that they're aware of, basically,
Mm-hmm.
that has a connection to, for example, irritable bowel syndrome. And we know that, and I don't want to offend anybody who practices using the low FODMAP diet as a tool, or anybody out there who has used it as a tool, but in my opinion, it it definitely has a role in symptom reduction, but
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't necessarily address improved digestive function, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it also is probably one of the most widely abused nutrition protocols out there, because as a protocol, it was always intended to be at most a 6-week intervention. And I mean, I'm sure you do. And I've had clients come to me who have been on it for years,
Mm-hmm.
years and years and years. And the Monash research itself suggests that being on a low FODMAP diet for an extended period of time, it's really intended as a diagnostic tool, can create more digestive issues because it negatively impacts the microbiome over time, because you're removing so many nourishing foods or functional foods. So I think that, again, like, we're talking about things that don't have to do with food, but some of the things we do with food also can
Mm-hmm.
have negative effect, even when we're trying to do something positive. So again, empathy, because it can be a very confusing process.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's important to look at all of these tools, whether it's low FODMAP that you want to try, or, in my practice, I tend towards a more hypoallergenic diet temporarily, just to temper reaction and inflammation due to impaired absorption, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like due to, hyperpermeability or anything along that line, but it's always temporary. And then the reintroduction process, again, when it comes to the food piece, I think it's really important for people to understand that the best part of that process and the most important part is the reintroduction process. So don't stay on an elimination for too long, because it's not a solution, unfortunately. It's just, in fact, it could create, like you said earlier, further problems along the road, further down the road.
Yeah. And I think I'm happy that you brought up low FODMAP. It's a really well researched diet. And I think it's really easy to kind of just feel like, okay, I feel better on it, I'm just going to keep these things out. Right. And this is what I really wanted to touch on when we started chatting about this episode and recording it, when it comes to everything but the food. I have like air quotes there, because I see it all the time where people come to me and they're like, yeah, like the list of foods I can't eat is longer than the ones I can. And then as we eliminate these things, we create this perpetuating cycle of we're eliminating more so that we're getting less diversity in our diet. We know our gut loves diversity. It loves
Yeah,
fiber. And you touched on that with FODMAP, like your gut loves garlic and onions and,
yeah,
all of these things. So if we're cutting them out, then yes, maybe for a short period of time. I've definitely had clients where
yeah.
we work on we have to remove some of those offenders while we, remove the wet logs, add that foundation so we can build that strong bonfire. And then hopefully you'll be able to have them. Maybe, we have to work your way up to certain amounts because your gut is like a muscle. We got to start working it out again with those FODMAPs. But the goal is always to get eating those foods again.
Yeah.
And because, our gut loves diversity. And sometimes it takes some time to get our gut to a place where it can handle those foods again.
Yeah.
But I think what I'm trying to say is it can feel comfortable in the low FODMAP realm sometimes. And I've been
Yeah.
there myself, right?
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
gone to, at the beginning of my journey, when I was dealing with anxiety and super high stress levels, I was having such digestive issues. And, what came first, the chicken or the egg? No clue. But my naturopath suggested I try a low FODMAP and do the challenge in the reintroduction phase. And I found out the trigger foods. And for a long time, I just didn't eat them.
Yeah.
And I was like, I feel better without it. I'm not bloated. Why would I add those back in?
Yeah.
And now I'm eating all of those foods super freely. And I don't disagree that there's sometimes that we need to, have a little bit of that, not restriction, but remove some of those offending foods for a bit while we do some healing, lay some groundwork. But the goal is always to bring them back in.
Yeah. And the food fear is real, right? Like we're
Oh,
both
for sure.
acknowledging that and we understand that for sure. But what's also real, and this is why it's a longer term goal, is that, I mean, research has significantly confirmed that variety is essential. Not just a fiber, but general variety. Fiber for sure, for sure, for sure. We under consume variety as North Americans in particular, but variety, like 30 plus plants a week, right? Different varieties of plants has been proven to, um, end up leading to or create a much more vibrant microbiome, much more diverse microbiotic environment, which is essential for gut health and for digestive capacity. But to be led down the path of doing that slowly is sometimes very, very important, right? Because of the food fear component, like you just said. And while doing that, I think this is the part that we really wanted to spend some time with today. While doing that, we know that the food piece is important, but while doing that, we also know that it's important to take care of your nervous system, primary. I agree with you. That's like probably the most important thing. Spend time with it, even if it's just doing, some deep breathing, 5 deep breaths before you sit down and eat your meal, eating in a calm environment, all the things that, relate to those type of factors. Making sure to pay attention to your sleep, getting 5 hours of sleep a night isn't enough. And it's in particular not enough for someone who's struggling with digestive issues because we need sleep. We need all the metabolites that get, processed through our sleep patterns and everything else. Daily movement, we mentioned. Meal timing, we mentioned. What else? Hydration, like that's also such a key factor, a simple one that many of us fall short of in a day, right? So yeah, I mean, it's fascinating when you really start to explore sort of all the connections to gut health that people don't necessarily focus their time on because we're so busy figuring out which food is bothering us. And I'm sure you have a lot to add vis-a-vis the gut-brain connection and the mental health piece here, because taking care of that, whether it's through talk therapy or IBS, gut-directed hypnotherapy has been proven to be as effective as dietary intervention. I've had clients go through gut-directed hypnotherapy processes. It's phenomenal. In traditional GI departments in places in the United States, you have a gut-directed hypnotherapist on staff in GI units dealing with very complex GI issues, patients with complex GI issues like IBS. We don't have that in Canada, unfortunately, but that just speaks to how important the gut-brain connection is in digestive dysfunction or those types of disorders, right? So again, not food related, really just taking care of the nervous system interaction, right? That whole gateway or pathway.
Yeah, when we mention, everything but the food, we always want to blame the food, but you just listed some great examples of things that we can focus on that are not even related to food at all. And I think that one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, what are some of the biggest mistakes you see people making in their gut and digestive health journey? And I know for me, the biggest mistake I see is just that, focusing only on the food and not focusing on all these other elements of life. But I'm curious if that's the same for you.
100%. That would be my number one answer as well. Unfortunately, because it really, is the one thing that people first turn to without any proper advice or direction. The second, if I had to come up with something different than that, I would say, unfortunately, for people who have dealt with these issues over such a long period of time. I mean, a lot of the women who come to see me are at the point where they literally can't enjoy their lives. They're canceling things all the time. Speaking right now in the summertime, they're not out enjoying, patio dinners and accepting pool party invitations
Mm-hmm.
because their their bowel schedule might not isn't predictable enough. Let's say their
Yeah.
bowel movement schedule. I mean, so right. So one of the things that I think that people who have been going through this for a really long time need to also be helped with or get guidance on is mindset, because at some point you start to feel, and I know that's such a thrown around term, but I
It's
feel
so
like
important.
it's so important because you actually, this is going to sound weird, but you have to believe that your body can do what it's supposed to do again.
Yeah.
You really, really do. And unfortunately, I think that the way that somebody can come to that place is only with help, right?
Mhm.
Through someone like us. I'm not talking about psychotherapy, or I'm talking about just like seeing small changes make a big difference. So, for example, going back to the meal spacing piece, right? I have actually had clients who were in the scenario I described, where dinner was either their biggest meal by far,
Mhm.
right? Or their only meal of the day.
Yeah.
And slowly but surely, kind of helping them introduce breakfast, which isn't easy for people who don't eat breakfast, we have to
Yeah.
acknowledge, right? But starting over time, developing a practice or a habit, I should say, where they are starting their day with an hour of waking up, let's say, and then planning meals spaced out properly. And over the period of even just a month, they
Mm-hmm.
might see a huge, huge difference. So that helps with their mindset, because now they're seeing that they can take control of the situation. Their body isn't sort of separated from their intentions as much as they think it is, you know?
Absolutely. I think that it's our mindset is so important. It's something that's not really easy to shift.
No.
And you need to really believe that you are capable of change and that you are comfortable with change. And if you are resilient or resistant to it, it can make that healing journey very difficult.
Yeah.
Um, Now I'm curious for you, whether it was for yourself or your work with clients, what is one underrated but very valuable tool in your digestive health toolbox?
I think that one of the most underrated tools, and it's funny talking about the mindset piece with this, I'll connect that.
Mhm.
In my opinion, one of the easiest, in brackets, and hardest, um, most accessible and least costly because it's free
Mhm.
tools in our digestive health toolbox is the power of breath, because our breathing pattern tells our nervous system where to be. Is it going to be in that rest and digest mode, or is it going to be in the fight or flight mode? When it goes into fight or flight mode, digestion takes a back seat. It gets downregulated and doesn't happen for all of us, even if you don't have digestive issues. The
Mhm.
breathing pattern, the message of your breathing literally tells your nervous system what to do with digestion. So I think that that's the most underutilized and undervalued. There's many, obviously, but that one in particular is one of the ones that I find remarkable because
Mhm.
it's so accessible to everybody. And the reason I put in brackets and hardest is because I have a note here on my laptop. I tell all my clients, it says, breathe 3 minutes.
Yeah.
Like, stopping to breathe in a busy day. And we're not talking about just like, sitting and not talking to anybody or whatever. We're talking about doing that deep Ayurvedic breathing that really sends a message to your nervous system that things are calm. And it's not that easy to do. And it takes some practice, but it's so, so well worth it, in my opinion, as one of the layers that we could use.
And how do you encourage your clients to incorporate breath work into their routine?
That's a great idea too. So I laugh when I go through client protocols, because there's literally a breathing exercise written out with an explanation how to do it. but that's not enough, right? We all have instructions. Instructions aren't always enough. As I said, the part about implementing it is really difficult because 4 minutes can feel like a lifetime,
Mm-hmm.
right? And my suggestion to clients is to do deep breathing 4 minutes a day, up to 3 times a day. So in terms of counsel, I try and tell them like, okay, the easiest time to do it might be when you're in your bed before you get out of bed, right? Unless you're someone with little kids and second your alarm goes off or you hear a baby cry, your feet hit the ground and you run. So then you have to find another time. But finding a time that's easiest in your day, putting it into your iPhone, on your calendar, getting a reminder, doing what I do, putting a sticky note on my laptop so that I remind myself every day. Literally tactical things like that to try and remember how to implement it and what to do.
Mm-hmm. That's a great example of like habit stacking, something you're
Yeah.
already doing, right? Okay. Well, I definitely want to be conscious of your time and I don't want to chat with you too long, so I'll chat all day long. But I want to finish with maybe this might be a big question, but someone who's listening that has, that long list of food intolerances, that just wants to feel better. I guess this is maybe a two-part question. One, can people still enjoy their favorite foods while working to support gut healing? And how? And maybe the second part is like maybe where do you think is like a good place for most people to start?
That's a fantastic question. Um, so yes, to the first question, I actually have worked with people who I don't um, do the food elimination piece of it with. And the reason for that is either they're coming from a place where they're already so restricted
Mhm.
um, by themselves, like they've already restricted themselves, or they're very, very fussy eaters to begin with, possibly due to,
Mhm.
history with digestive issues. So you definitely can. However, you need to implement some of the other things. So where I would start, the easiest way to start, in my opinion, is taking a look at two things. First of all, hydration, because so many of us are not meeting hydration goals. You wake up in a naturally dehydrated state. So you're already behind the eight ball. If you are a regular size adult, not drinking 6 to 8 glasses of water a day, from a digestive perspective, I would say that's really, really important. That's the easiest one.
Mhm.
After that, I would say, again, maybe looking at things to do with meal hygiene. So,
Mhm.
are you eating in a calm state? Are you rushing through your meals? Are you taking the time to chew every single bite? Because we know that so much of the primary stage of digestion happens in the mouth, right? That's
Mhm.
an important part. Most people aren't even doing that. So that's a very kind of preliminary place to start that just starts to make you conscious of how you're eating, right? And then
Mhm.
again, the next step, like we've talked about, is figuring out, am I actually overloading my body at any point during the day? Am I eating my meals? Um, the old adage, eat breakfast like a king and dinner like a pauper, might be something that somebody needs to start working on because most of us don't, not most of us, sorry, many people don't eat breakfast, right? So, more, again, just to summarize it, I would say more focus on how you eat if you're
Mhm.
not going to start, addressing the food piece. The way I address the food piece, whether somebody has eliminations in place in my protocol or not, is at some point pretty soon in, like within a few weeks, I start working on dietary enhancements. So
Mhm.
looking at probiotic foods, which is close to your heart, looking at fermented food sources, making sure somebody has enough dietary fiber and variety in their diet. So kind of stair stepping into those enhancements would be the next step. So this is all stuff people can do without taking away all the foods that they really enjoy. Honestly, um, I mean, I don't want to use the barbecue chips or necessarily an unhealthy choice, but birthday cakes at birthdays or, whatever it is that or pasta, like whatever it is that you really are anxious around trying to lose in your life. I think you can, not I think, I know you can resolve your
Mm-hmm.
digestive issues without necessarily eliminating those things.
100%. Like I remember, in my health journey and when I was in my FODMAP phase, I love Indian food, like curries and, paneer. So there's dairy in there too. And like, I just love it. I remember
Yeah.
going out for food, like Indian food with friends, and the onions in there would make me break out into sweat. Like I was just not like, I remember leaving dinner early because I was having it felt like a hot flash from all the onions. And I don't even really think about onions. I eat them and your gut loves them, but it definitely took me paying attention to my stress levels, my sleep, over exercising, making sure I was getting enough rest, and
Yeah.
all of these pieces that I was like, had until I pursued, the formal education. It's like, how is this connected to how well I'm digesting my food? And the answer is, it is very connected. So
Yeah.
that's very valuable information. Thank you, Bonnie, for that.
My pleasure. It's been so great talking to you. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I would love to kind of finish up our conversation by letting listeners know where they can get in touch with you, connect with you, send you a message if this episode resonated with them.
Sure. So if you're on Instagram, I'm at Shift Nutrition and Wellness. And I also host a free Facebook group for people with digestive issues, women predominantly with digestive issues. And you can find it on Facebook. It's called Shift into Healthy Habits for Digestion. And in that group, we have a lot of these types of discussions. I usually run a monthly challenge. So there is a lot of group coaching within that group, and it's a lot of complementary information. So there's a lot of resources in there, workshops, that kind of thing. And I would love to see somebody who's struggling come into the group and sort of get more information, more layered information about a lot of the things we've talked about today, actually.
Amazing. That sounds like such a valuable resource. Once again, Bonnie, thank you so much for chatting with me. If you are listening and you found this episode helpful, then make sure you pass it along to a friend or a family member and leave us a rating or review. And Bonnie, thank you so much for chatting with me.
Thanks, Britt. It's been great to be here.